Bill Whitaker joins us now. And I know that this was a case that you covered extensively
from beginning to end
in the 90s. Let's go back and let's take a look at the history and legacy and what a new piece of potential evidence could mean to this case. If this knife is important in the commission of a crime, what does it do to the legacy of the O.J. Simpson acquittal?
Well, I will tell you that first we have to wait to find out what we find out at all about this knife, what we can glean from it at all. And this is, if I recall, the third knife that has been
There was one that
discovered.
was found, right? You recall, Bill, and
there was one that he supposedly bought at a cutlery shop. There was another that a neighbor found in a storm drain, I think, near the house, and now this one. And the first two, if I recall correctly, were never brought into evidence. So now we have this one. So it's got to be checked. They've got to check to see if there's anything on it, any DNA, anything that they can tie to the crime. But I believe, as you were saying earlier, that he couldn't be tried again for this particular crime in the state of California. They'd have to come up with something as a federal case to be able to push it forward. So all this, at this point, it seems like it's another strange twist in a case that's full of strange twists.
What does it do in terms of the attention that's once again brought on the LAPD and how they approach evidence, how they did back then, and apparently how they continue to do with the discovery of this knife?
The handling of evidence, along with what you were talking about with Detective Furman and the glove and all of that, the next biggest issue was how the LAPD handled the evidence, and it was made front and center in the crime, in the trial, that it was not handled properly, that it was not stored properly, that it was not tested properly, that it was compromised in so many different ways. And here we have another knife, and I don't have any idea how long it's been in the possession of the LAPD, but it seems that it didn't rise to the level of, oh, this is significant. Oh, we need to handle this differently. It sat around for, what are they saying, for a year or years?
Right,
sometime, yes.
Yeah.
For years. I would be reluctant to tie that into a mishandling of evidence by the LAPD. It may have just been that it didn't rise to the level of being
and certainly for one officer who received the knife and kept it in his possession for all those years, something about that knife made him think
something interesting, a memento, something macabre. Bill, I want, you know, interestingly enough, we have a lot of young viewers at CBS, and I'm sure a lot of people, first of all, they don't realize that O.J. Simpson ultimately did go to jail. He's sitting in jail right now for 33 years because of an armed robbery and kidnapping charge. But set the scene for us, because I remember, I was 24 when this happened. I remember the Bronco chase very clearly. O.J. Simpson was as big of a star as we could get in America. He was a Hall of Fame quarterback. He was beloved by millions. He had transcended, is the word we used a lot back then, race. What did I say? Quarterback, running back for the Buffalo Bills.
And on top of that, he was a movie star.
A movie star, right.
Yeah, and lived the good life. I mean, he was a fixture in West LA.
So to see him in that Bronco chase, just describe for us as a young reporter covering this, what it meant for you and for the rest of the country.
It was, I can't even tell you how big a deal this became. It was a murder case. It was about race. It was about celebrity. It was about abuse, spousal abuse.
Jealousy.
It was about jealousy and rage. I mean, it had all of the elements. It was a soap opera, and but it was a serious soap opera. We were talking about murder, and we were talking about evidence, and we were talking about whether race played into how someone was tried and convicted. So it covered a lot of very important issues, but the atmosphere around it was it was a circus. Coming and going every day, there were crowds out in front, and they were cheering, and they were picking sides, and they would jeer at some attorneys coming in, and they would clap for other attorneys coming in. Across the street was, they called it Camp OJ, where the media was set up, and it was a little city. We had skyscrapers of scaffolding. So, you know, the one network was in front, and the next one behind would have to build a higher scaffolding, and the one behind that would build a higher scaffolding, so we could see the courthouse. The Stanford band came and played one morning.
I didn't know that.
There were the Dancing Itos that were on the Tonight Show. They would come out. I mean, it was just a crazy, crazy scene surrounding this very significant trial.
We have two updates here. Ron Goldman's father has spoken to the New York Daily News saying, right now it's fascinating, but you know, even if they find evidence on it, the knife, and it turns out to be the knife, it's probably going to be much ado about nothing because they're not going to try him a second time. And F. Lee Bailey, who was one of O.J. Simpson's attorneys, told Fox 25 in Boston, all of the matters have been adjudicated. The matter is closed.
Well, yes, except for my federal prosecution footnote, which I will say, candidly, is very remote and not a likely possibility at all. But at the same time, you know, strange things have happened in this case over and over. But one point Bill wanted to amplify, and he's so right, is the minute they called into question the way the evidence was handled, it enabled them to make an argument that really was unreasonable doubt, not reasonable, but it worked precisely for the point Bill made, which is here's blood from the scene, here's blood from his arm. Maybe they confused it and it's both from his arm, and it worked. It was amazing.
It worked.
Because the point is, it was overwhelming, you know, odds in the billions, right, on the DNA, if you believe that this is from the scene and this is the sample. But they just turned around and said, maybe they just mishandled it. And it was an unreasonable celebrity dynamic. But coupled with what I said about detective caught in a lie. And by the way, Vince Bugliosi, the famous late prosecutor who I believe died this year, wrote a book about the case that I read, and he said they should have put into evidence the car chase as consciousness of guilt. I thought he made a very compelling point in his book, and he even went so far as to write out the summation, you know, proposed summation, which is, ladies and gentlemen, who would do that and be in a car acting that way if they had nothing to do with it? The counter argument, real quick, Bill might make is, of course, you could panic, you know, obviously. Even, you know, you're innocent and people are calling your conduct into question, so you might panic and do that. But I think that the consciousness of guilt would have won out in that instance. And I was surprised, and I cited as another mistake, unfortunately, that the prosecutors made.
Well, you know, and that one moment that electrified the entire country was the moment when Mr. Simpson was asked to put on that glove.
Oh,
and you wonder, how did the prosecution allow that to happen?
Real quick, I'll never forget standing in a courtroom with a Drug Enforcement Administration agent, and I said, you see this beeper, Derek? Let's call the number on the judge's phone and it'll ring, it'll be great. And he was much more senior than me. He said, absolutely not. You never do anything like that. What if the call fails? It doesn't go through. You're going to look silly and stupid. And I learned that lesson, and you don't do Perry Mason demonstrations.
Do you remember filing that night?
Oh,
Bill?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have never been in a courtroom, and I covered a number of trials out there. I have never been in a courtroom that provided so many gasp moments,
right,
where everyone in the courtroom was like, and this was the biggest gasp moment. And, you know, I mean, in hindsight, I'm not an attorney, and the same that you're,
he's like, oh yeah,
right.
and the same that you're
his
saying.
acting skills probably came in.
If you don't know the answer, then don't ask. And this is a glove that had been wet and that had been stored. I think it was in cold storage for a year. I mean, it's going to harden and perhaps even shrink. So a year later, you pull it out and ask the defendant to put on the glove. And he was a B-grade actor, but he was an actor. And he made the most of it. He was struggling to put that on and showing everyone in the courtroom, I see, it doesn't fit.
And then the corollary summation point, quote, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And that's what we all take away from the case 20 years later.
But there were a number of things like that. You're talking about, you know, the DNA. The presentation of DNA took a month.
Right.
It was a graduate level course on DNA with alleles. And I mean, it just went on and on and on. And you could see after maybe day 2 that this was like right over the jury's head. Not that the jury was not smart enough to grasp it. It was just too much. Instead of saying to someone that everyone's DNA is different, we found this DNA, it matches Mr. Simpson, and just go on from there, they went into such great detail And I remember at the end of the presentation, one of the jurors was dismissed. And we all go running after him to find out, well, what did all this DNA presentation, did it mean anything to you? And he says, everybody's blood sample is different. Everybody, and it's like, that's totally not the case. Your blood and your blood sample and your DNA, these are not the same. But he just didn't get it. I think they tuned out.
They would have benefited from a well-known journalist to teach them storytelling skills to a jury.
That's true.
When we're talking about the DNA, though, and we're fast-forwarding now to 2016, and this knife has been found on the O.J. property decades ago by a construction worker, handed off to an off-duty LAPD officer back then in 1998. It comes to the attention of the LAPD recently because the officer apparently tried to have this knife engraved. From what you know as a former federal prosecutor, Doug, about DNA, is the potential there for there still to be lingering DNA on this knife?
It's possible. It's possible. I'm not so sure how likely it is, but it's definitely possible,
And the fact that it's been in the possession of someone outside of, what we learn on TV detective shows as the chain of custody.
But the problem is, sorry to interrupt you, Contessa, the problem is you're going to get all of the same arguments, which is, it's 3 years after the fact. How do we really know who put it there? Was it planted? Right back to the same concepts. And that's going to just eviscerate and weaken it further and further, and I don't think you'll have any kind of smoking gun effect. But having said that, if they find DNA and it's O.J. Simpson's, I mean, it's going to be interesting in terms of some historical footnotes to this case. But I mean, as F. Lee Bailey pointed out, and he's been around the block a long time, an acquittal is double jeopardy for the most part. And there's no murder statute in federal court straight up. In other words, just murdering an individual. You murder a congressman, you murder the president, there are federal statutes. But there's no murder. The only thing would be civil rights, and he's not a state actor. He's not with the government.
When we're talking about memorabilia, too, that has come into play over and over again because it was the barging into a Las Vegas hotel room after what O.J. Simpson said was stolen memorabilia that landed him
in jail.
In jail. Once again, can you give a sense of how important this case has been for the American culture continuing past and how pivotal it was?
Well,
and is.
All of this about the knife just shows that there's endless fascination about this case. I mean, there were cameras in the courtroom, and people watched it religiously. The whole country was watching this. The audiences for the soap operas dropped precipitously because everybody was watching this trial.
And they never came back, by the way.
And, Robert Kardashian was on the Dream Team. I mean, this was almost like the first reality show, and this is almost presaged by Kardashian, and his kids were at the house when O.J. came. I mean, it's like you couldn't make this up. And the whole idea of reality TV and our fascination with celebrity, I guess we always had that, but
there were there were those cheesy moments like Faye Resnick, Kato Kaelin.
Think also, guys,
everybody.
Think also how many people out there are thirsting, for lack of a better term, for some concrete proof. I knew it. Aha.
Well, that's so it's interesting. Contessa just read something that Fred Goldman said to the press. And we watched throughout this entire 9-month-plus trial, Fred Goldman and his wife and his sister, Ronald Goldman's sister, Kim, standing there or sitting there during the trial, their faces in agony.
Right.
We watched Nicole Brown's sister. She was primarily the spokesperson that I saw.
Denise, right?
Denise, right? And Fred Goldman was devastated after the verdict was read. Bill, just describe who the Goldmans were, Nicole's sister, what this meant for them. Because we do talk about it in terms of this transcending race and becoming about an issue related to the racial construct of the United States. But these were families who lost their loved ones.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what, that's kind of what's lost in all of the soap opera aspect of this. This was about a murder. There were 2 people murdered, brutally murdered. And the families lost loved ones. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read, and I was sitting right behind the Goldman family. Kim Goldman was right in front of me, and the sob that came out of her was, it was palpable. The whole courtroom heard it. And you could not overlook the fact that this was a significant significant loss to these families. And everybody else is out there looking at it on all these other levels we're talking about, you know, the race level, the celebrity level, the this, the that. For these families,
you know,
this
also,
was a murder case, and they lost their loved ones.
Guys, you know, not to dredge this up, but Robert Kardashian, true or false, he looked stunned and somewhat shocked when that verdict was read. No. And I never forgot that as a trial lawyer. I mean, again, want to be fair. There's always a counter argument and so on and so forth. But if you look at footage of that, he was really shocked.
Well, one of the things
I think everybody was stunned.
And in the book, Jeffrey Toobin's book, and which is based off, the miniseries is based off of, there's an interesting part in there where we know that Robert Shapiro was known for being a guy to make deals with the district attorney's office.
Yeah.
And he may have also probably attempted to do that before they brought Johnny
More of
Cochran.
a plea bargaining approach. I mean,
Right.
I read the book, The Run of His Life by Jeff Toobin. It was an excellent book, of course. But as Bill said, I mean, there were just so many different factors that came together. And also Judge Ito, not to criticize the judge, but many judges told me that he really lost control.
Lost control of the courtroom.
Essentially. Yeah.
But you were saying that everybody was stunned. Everybody was stunned. I mean, no matter which way you came down on the trial, for that instant when the verdict came out, if you supported the verdict or if you didn't, for that brief second, it was like you couldn't believe.
But my point was, in the sense that this man had the relationship with the defendant, knew maybe a lot more, you know, he was cloaked in attorney-client privilege, remember that. He wasn't a criminal lawyer, but at the same time, hey, I'm an attorney, so much of this is privilege. And the reality, the only point I was making is to see him be so shocked. I don't want to read too much into it, but as a trial lawyer, it made an impact on me, quite honestly.
Given the intensity that you gave to the case as it was unfolding, the trial and the verdict and the aftermath, what was your reaction at hearing that a knife had reportedly been discovered on his property years after the acquittal and had been turned over to an officer with the LAPD, and that officer sat on the knife for decades?
Truthfully, my reaction was, here we go again.
I agree.
We can't get over this, and we can't get enough of it.
Well, because it's unsolved.
That's the key point,
the
though,
Los Angeles
right.
police captain said in that press conference, the case is open. The same way I think the interest would be if the Black Dahlia case we found something.
Take your point and just frame it this way. Let's say hypothetically he was convicted and he's serving life imprisonment and this was found. Nobody would care, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that the acquittal
Fascination.
brings into play all of these things. You know, as I said earlier, people thirsting, oh my God, I can't believe he actually really did do it. You know, people also say he was found guilty in the civil case. Nobody's found guilty in a civil case. They're liable for wrongful death. Right, responsible
but,
for
you know,
wrongful death.
and there was a verdict.
Right.
He was found not guilty. So in that sense, when we were talking about double jeopardy, it is over. This is just an interesting sidebar.
But another legal point is there's a distinction between not guilty and innocent. People throw these terms around all the time. He's innocent. Innocent means factually innocent, you didn't do it. Not guilty is a legal term. It means ostensibly that the prosecutors didn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Enough evidence to prove it.
You know, in some countries they have a third verdict, not proven. And you can debate whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. A lot of people say, no, that's bad, because then people will say, oh, he only beat it on a technicality. I think Scotland has that. Guilty, not proven. That label, my point is, would have been better for this case.
Didn't Mr. Simpson attempt to write a book or write a book called If
Did.
I
Yes.
Did it? Did he write that book?
What about If I Did It?
If I Did It was the title of the book.
And?
He never, if I recall, this is many, many years ago, he never actually addressed, you know, did he do it? That was not the subject of the case.
Right, my recollection was that it was a hypothetical formulation, essentially. You know,
There were many years afterwards when he was trying to pay off the civil judgment that he was doing anything he could to make money. So regardless,
or not, or not. Seriously, I mean, he moved to Florida, where
homestead exemptions.
yeah,
and
so
all
they
that,
couldn't touch his house, they couldn't touch his car, they couldn't touch his pension that he was getting from. And if you ask the Goldmans, they will tell you that they got a pittance of what was declared by the court.
right? So maybe I was drawing the correlation. It was after the civil judgment, and he was doing everything he could to make money, not necessarily to pay off the civil judgment.
But the other big point is, think of the difference. I wrote an article about this, actually, which is you had two OJ personas. Going into this first trial, he was a beloved celebrity and a Hertz-ad pitchman and a movie actor and a legendary football great. And what happened, happened. By the time of the second case, his persona was, he got away with 2 homicides, he's horrible, he's evil. My point being, that second case was actually quite weak. And if that had been brought against the first O.J., if you're following me, he would have walked out in 5 minutes flat with an acquittal, because the arguments would have been, these cooperators are making this up. It was his own memorabilia, for crying out loud. I mean, and the point is there was just a huge distinction. And sadly, or not sadly, it was payback for the acquittal, that second case. It really was.
I think
particularly on the sentencing, okay?
I think so on the
How do you
sentencing.
get that kind of sentence on an essentially Mickey Mouse, sorry for that legal term, case where he goes into a hotel room, they're saying guns, guns, guns. There's a contemporaneous tape. Nobody mentions the word gun. So, I mean, I thought it was a weak case, and I was therefore surprised at the intense payback aspect of it.
The other interesting, when we've talked a bit about it, is the fact that right after the verdict, or during the reading of the verdict, you saw cameras trained on crowds of white people, and then you saw cameras trained on, and I guess everybody in the media decided, we know the verdict's coming, let's get some shots where we can actually get reaction from people as it's happening. To this day, you will talk to people, and this is now subjective, but I'll talk to African-American friends, and a lot of them will say, I know that O.J. probably did it, even though I was one of those who cheered when that verdict came across. And they say, because, and this is the case that people will make, which is that, for all the instances that happened prior to O.J. in Los Angeles, but before that in Mississippi.
Except for one thing, and I'd love to hear Bill's take on this, which is that O.J.
So that's what they'll say about why they were cheering, and not necessarily, because it became less about Ronald Goldman and
But he was
Nicole
in
Brown,
an incredibly poor poster child, as it were, for those issues.
And that's what
We've had horrific injustices in this country, obviously, particularly in the South. But I mean, here's a guy at the top of society, member of the Riviera Country Club, living on an estate in Brentwood. I'm not criticizing him for any of that. But to anoint him as the poster child for, racial injustice in a courtroom really wasn't a direct fit, in a sense.
And I don't think that this was, that the jury even saw it in terms of payback. I really don't. I mean, I truly do not believe that. If you're in the courtroom the whole time, what you're talking about, you have the detective who found everything. He found the glove at the murder site. He found the glove at the home.
Reasonable doubt in Los Angeles.
There's the blood that's in the car that sort of looks like it was smeared around, and this is a detective who was caught in a lie, and a big lie. That he had never ever said this racial slur, the N-word. And a researcher who had interviewed him just several months before had him on tape saying it over and over and over and over again. So here you've got the guy who's at the center of the case, and he's caught in a great big lie. It casts doubt on everything that happened.
And think how much more explosive it is, because it goes to a core issue in the case, as you said right at the outset. Race. I mean, if he had lied about his shoe size, I'm not being cute.
It would have been a big difference.
It's different. I mean, I've never used this epithet, and he got caught on tape. What I never understood, quite honestly, as a trial lawyer, is knowing that he was tape recorded for all of those interviews, why would he go into a courtroom and say, I've never used that? I never understood that. It was almost comically to the point of, was he trying to sandbag the prosecution? I mean, I'm not suggesting that, but
the prosecution,
I never understood that.
Even before that tape showed up, the prosecution should have known.
They should have known that,
because there were a number of people, and this is you're testing my 20-year-old memory, but there were a number of cases where people came to them and said, I heard him say this word. I've heard him say this word before.
Absolutely.
But since it wasn't proven and it was his word against somebody else's, the prosecution chose to overlook it.
How did they miss the tape? I don't even. How did they miss the tape that they had of him?
Well, this was a woman. I believe she was in North Carolina, and she was writing a book about police officers, and she had just come across him.
They didn't have it, to answer your question.
Yes, they didn't have it.
The prosecution didn't have it.
No,
they didn't know about it.
They didn't even know about it.
They were caught blindsided by it. Yeah.
But when this researcher heard Furman on the stand saying, "I've never used this word," she called the defense and said,
obligated
"Well,
to bring
it's
it
like,
up,
in fact, he has, and I have a tape of it." So you go into court, and Johnny Cochran said, "So you've never used this word?" He said, "Never used this word." So how do you explain this? Boom, and plays it in court.
Oh, it was unbelievable.
Another gasp moment.
That was unreal.
And here we are more than 20 years later talking about the intricacies of this case, talking about the way O.J. Simpson got acquitted more than 20 years ago. And we're talking about it today because of this revelation that the LAPD is investigating the discovery of a knife on O.J. Simpson's property in the years following the court case that apparently was handed over from a construction worker to an off-duty LAPD officer who then sat on it for almost 20 years. We have much more of this to come. Bill Whitaker, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your memories, your insight, and incredible recall of these details about the story that you covered so intensely.
My pleasure.
Doug Burns sticks with us right after a break. You're watching CBSN.